The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Alexander Sterling's penthouse office, casting long shadows across his modernistic desk. At 45, he had everything money could buy, well, almost everything. His fingers drummed against the sleek surface of his desk as he stared at the plain brown envelope that his secretary had just delivered. No return address, just his name typed in simple black letters. Something about it made his stomach twist. After 20 years in business, he'd developed a sixth sense for trouble, and this innocent-looking envelope was setting off all his alarms. He picked it up, testing its weight. Light, probably just a few papers inside. The security team had already cleared it, so at least he knew it wasn't dangerous in the conventional sense. Still, his fingers hesitated before breaking the seal. 4 photographs slid out, landing face up on his desk. The breath caught in his throat. "Impossible," he whispered, picking up one of the photos with trembling hands. The face staring back at him was like looking into a mirror that could turn back time. The same sharp jawline, the same intense dark eyes, even that slight quirk to the right eyebrow that his mother used to tease him about. But this wasn't an old photo of himself. The graduation cap and gown were modern, and the date stamp in the corner was from just last week. His eyes darted to the other 3 photos, all identical faces, same graduation ceremony, different poses. His phone buzzed, making him jump. Another merger meeting in 5 minutes. But for the first time in his career, business was the last thing on his mind. He spread the photos out, studying each face. 3 boys and a girl, all with his features perfectly reflected in their 18-year-old faces. A small note had fallen out with the photos. He recognized the handwriting instantly, and his heart stopped for a moment. How many late-night love letters had he received in this same elegant script during their whirlwind romance? Before everything fell apart. They deserved to know their father. "I'm sorry for keeping them from you, Isabella." Isabella, his ex-wife. The only woman he'd ever truly loved, and the one who'd disappeared without a trace 3 months after their divorce was finalized. 18 years ago. The timing hit him like a physical blow. 18 years. 4 kids who looked exactly like him. Isabella's mysterious disappearance. It all added up to a truth that seemed too incredible to believe. His phone buzzed again. The merger meeting. 12 people were waiting for him in the conference room. 12 people whose combined net worth was in the billions. Any other day, that would have been the most important thing in his world. He pressed the intercom button. "May, cancel everything for today." His usually steady voice cracked slightly. "Sir?" "The merger meeting." "Cancel it all. Family emergency." Family. The word felt strange on his tongue. For 18 years he'd been alone. Sure, there had been relationships, but nothing stuck. He'd thrown himself into building his tech empire instead, becoming the youngest self-made billionaire in Asia. Now, in one morning, he might have gone from being alone to having 4 children. His hands shook as he reached for his private phone, the one only 5 people in the world had the number to. "Jack, I need everything you can find on Isabella Martinez. Last known location, current residence, job, everything." And Jack, "I need it yesterday." He walked to the window, staring out at the city skyline he'd helped shape. Somewhere out there was the woman who'd broken his heart 18 years ago. And with her, apparently, were 4 kids who shared his DNA. The photos seemed to burn a hole in his pocket where he'd carefully tucked them away. One face in particular kept floating in his mind, the girl. She had his eyes, but Isabella's smile, that slightly mischievous upturn of the lips that had first caught his attention at a charity gala 2 decades ago. His office suddenly felt too small, too confining. The space that had been his sanctuary, his command center for building a tech empire worth billions, now felt like a cage. He needed answers, and for the first time in his life, all his money and power might not be enough to get them. The sun had climbed higher, eliminating the shadows in his office. A new day, and nothing would ever be the same again. He loosened his tie, a rare gesture of uncertainty for a man known for his unshakable composure. The weight of the photos in his pocket matched the weight in his chest, half joy, half terror, completely overwhelming. 4 kids, his kids. Somewhere out there were 4 young adults who shared his blood, his features, and who knew what else. Had they inherited his drive for innovation, his quick temper? his inability to back down from a challenge? Or had Isabella's influence shaped them into entirely different people? The questions multiplied with each passing moment. But one thing was certain, he needed to find them. All of them. And this time, he wouldn't let Isabella disappear again. Not until he had answers. Not until he knew his children. Looking at his reflection in the window, he could see traces of those young faces from the photos in his own. Somewhere out there were 4 18-year-olds starting their adult lives, not knowing that their father was a man whose technology they probably used every day. That was about to change. Everything was about to change. 3 days had passed since Alexander received those photographs, and he hadn't slept more than a few hours. His private investigator, Jack, had been working around the clock, and finally, the pieces were coming together. Alexander sat in his home office, surrounded by screens displaying everything they'd discovered about Isabella's life over the past 18 years. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, but he barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the footage from a high school graduation ceremony in Boston, watching 4 specific students walk across the stage. "Play it again," he said softly, leaning forward. The video showed the moment each of his children, he was certain now they were his, received their diplomas. James, the first one, practically bounced across the stage. Even in this grainy footage, Alexander could see the excitement in his stride. The principal had announced him as the school's top computer science student. Michael followed shortly after, his walk more measured, calculated. He'd graduated with honors in business and economics. Then came Daniel, who seemed to know everyone on stage, shaking hands and beaming that magnetic smile that Alexander recognized from his own younger days. And finally, there was his daughter. Not Sarah or any common name, Isabella had named her Area. She moved with quiet confidence, her achievements in mathematics and science announced to proud applause. "They're all overachievers," Jack's voice crackled through the speakerphone, "just like their old man." Alexander couldn't help but smile. "What else did you find?" "Isabella's been teaching mathematics at a local community college. Lives in a modest apartment in Brighton. No romantic relationships we could find. Seems she devoted everything to raising the kids." The screen showed more images. Isabella walking to work, shopping at local markets, helping at school events. She looked different now, her hair shorter, gray, starting to show at the temples, but her eyes still held that same determination he remembered. "The kids?" Alexander asked, his voice catching slightly. "Each one's a mini-you in their own way. James has already developed 3 apps, though he released them under a pseudonym. Michael runs a successful investment club at school, turned $500 of club dues into $15,000 in a year. Daniel was student body president, started a peer mentoring program. And Aria? She won the state mathematics championship 3 years running." Alexander's chest tightened with pride, immediately followed by a wave of sadness for all the moments he'd missed. First steps, first words, first achievements, all gone. "There's more," Jack continued. "I found Isabella's journal entries from right after the divorce. She'd just discovered she was pregnant. The entries, you might want to read them yourself." New documents popped up on one of the screens. Alexander's hands shook as he read. "How do I tell him? The man I loved is disappearing into boardrooms and hostile takeovers. Yesterday, I watched him destroying Mr. Chen, the man who gave him his first job. He called it business, but I saw the pleasure in his eyes when he won. When he took everything. What would that kind of power do to our children?" Alexander sat back, the words hitting him like physical blows. Mr. Chen. He hadn't thought about his old mentor in years. The takeover had been legal profitable, but looking back now, it had been cruel. More photos appeared on the screens, the quadruplets growing up. Halloween costumes, science fairs, sports events. In every photo, they were together, supporting each other. Isabella had given them something he never had, a real family. "The kids don't know about you," Jack added quietly. Isabella never told them who their father was, just that he was a businessman who wasn't ready for family life. Alexander stood up, walking to his window. The city lights blurred as he fought back tears. "She was wrong," he whispered. "I wasn't ready then, but I am now." His phone buzzed, another message about the upcoming merger. Once that would have been his whole world. Now it seemed trivial compared to what he'd discovered. "What's their daily routine?" he asked, already forming a plan. James hits the local coffee shop every morning to code. Michael checks the stock market at the library after school. Daniel volunteers at the youth center on weekends. Aria practices piano at the community center every Thursday. 4 lives. 4 incredible young people who carried his blood but had none of his wealth. Who had his drive but had learned to use it differently. Who had grown up loved and supported, even if they'd missed having a father. "Book me a flight to Boston," Alexander said firmly. "And Jack, thank you." As he packed his bag that night, Alexander caught his reflection in the mirror. The face that had launched 1,000 tech startups, graced magazine covers, and struck fear into competitors now showed something different: vulnerability, hope, and a trace of fear. Tomorrow, he would confront Isabella, not as the powerful billionaire he'd become, but as the man who had lost his family before he knew he had one. The truth was unraveling, and with it, the carefully constructed walls around his heart. He slipped the graduation photos into his wallet, right next to where he kept a small picture of Isabella all these years. It was time to face his past and, hopefully, build a future with the family he never knew he had. The community college hallway seemed endless as Alexander walked toward room 204. His designer shoes clicked against the worn linoleum floor, each step bringing him closer to the moment he'd rehearsed 1,000 times on the flight to Boston. Through the narrow window in the door, he could see her. Isabella stood at a whiteboard, explaining complex equations to a small class of adult students. Her hair was shorter now, touches of silver at the temples, but she still used her hands when she spoke, still wrote her numbers with that slight artistic flair. The class ended, students filing past him with barely a glance. He waited until the last one left, then stepped into the doorway. Isabella's back was to him as she erased the board. "Your handwriting hasn't changed," he said softly. The eraser froze mid-swipe. Her shoulder tensed, but she didn't turn around. "I wondered how long it would take you to find us." 18 years, Alexander replied, his voice rougher than he intended. "It took 18 years, Isabella." She finally turned, and the years between them seemed to vanish. She was older, yes, but her eyes still held that fierce intelligence that had first drawn him in. "You got my letter." 4 graduation photos and a note. "That's how you decided to tell me I have children." He hadn't meant to raise his voice, but the words echoed off the classroom walls. "Lower your voice," Isabella hissed, glancing nervously at the door. "My next class isn't for another hour. I checked your schedule." Alexander moved into the room, closing the door behind him. "Why, Isabella? Why didn't you tell me?" She sank into her chair, suddenly looking tired. "You want to know why? Turn on any business channel. Read any tech magazine. The Alexander Sterling I knew, who dreamed of changing the world with his innovations, turned into someone who crushes competitors for sport. You destroyed Mr. Chen." "That was business," he interrupted, but his voice lacked conviction. "That was cruelty," Isabella shot back. "He gave you your first internship, taught you everything you knew about the industry, and you didn't just take his company, you humiliated him. Made sure he'd never work in tech again." Alexander opened his mouth to defend himself, but the words died in his throat, because she was right. "I found out I was pregnant a week after signing the divorce papers," Isabella continued, her voice softer now. "When I saw what power was doing to you, I couldn't let that happen to our children." Before Alexander could respond, voices in the hallway made them both turn. Through the door's window, they could see 4 familiar faces approaching, deep in conversation. "No," Isabella whispered, going pale. "They're not supposed to be here now." The door opened and time seemed to stop. James walked in first, saying something about a coding problem he wanted to discuss. He froze mid-sentence, his eyes darting between his mother and the stranger who looked so eerily like himself. Michael followed, his analytical mind visibly putting the pieces together as his eyes widened in recognition. Daniel stepped in next, automatically moving to stand protectively near his mother. And Aria, brilliant Aria, took one look at Alexander's face and understood everything. "Mom?" James's voice cracked slightly. "Who is this?" Isabella stood slowly, her hands trembling. "Children, He's our father, isn't he?" Aria's quiet voice cut through the tension. "That's why you never showed us pictures. Why you never talked about him." Alexander couldn't take his eyes off them. Standing together, the family resemblance was undeniable. James had his nose, Michael his jaw, Daniel his build, and Aria had his eyes, exactly as they appeared in his college photos. "Is it true?" Daniel demanded, looking at his mother. "All those times we asked about our father, you said he wasn't ready for a family. But you never told him about us, did you?" Isabella's silence was answer enough. "I'm Alexander Sterling," he said softly, addressing his children directly for the first time. "And yes, I'm your father. I just found out about you 3 days ago." "Sterling?" Michael's eyes narrowed. "As in Sterling Tech, the company that developed the Reality OS system?" Alexander nodded, watching their faces as recognition dawned. These kids had grown up using his technology, never knowing they were using their father's creations. "Why now?" James asked, his voice sharp. "Why show up after 18 years?" "Because your mother finally told me," Alexander replied honestly. "She sent me your graduation photos. If I had known sooner." He trailed off, the weight of lost years heavy in the air. Aria stepped forward, studying his face intently. "You really didn't know?" "No," he whispered. "I didn't know I had 4 amazing children who've accomplished so much already. Who grew up to be incredible people without my help." "Whoa." His voice broke, and suddenly the room was too small, too full of emotions and unspoken words. 18 years of absence crashed into this single moment of presence. Isabella moved to stand between him and the children, her teacher's instinct for control taking over. "Perhaps we should all sit down and—" "I need some air," Daniel announced, turning abruptly and walking out. Michael followed him silently, his face unreadable. James lingered for a moment, looking lost, before he too left. Only Aria remained, still studying Alexander's face as if memorizing every detail. "You have Mom's research papers in your wallet," she said suddenly. "The ones she published under her maiden name. They're worn at the edges from being unfolded and refolded." Alexander reached for his wallet automatically, surprised. "How did you?" "Because I do the same thing with newspaper articles about Sterling Tech," she replied quietly. "I've been following your work for years, wondering if there was a connection. Mom named me Aria because you used to play piano, didn't you?" The simple observation, so accurate and unexpected, made his throat tight. Every Sunday morning, he managed to say, "It drove your mother crazy because I only knew one song." A ghost of a smile crossed Aria's face. "Moonlight Sonata. Mom still hums it sometimes when she's grading papers." In that moment, standing in a simple classroom with his daughter and his ex-wife, Alexander Sterling, the man who controlled billions, felt completely powerless. And somehow that felt exactly right. News travels fast in the digital age. By the next morning, every major news outlet was running the story. Tech billionaire Alexander Sterling discovers secret family. Reporters camped outside Isabella's apartment building, hoping to catch a glimpse of the quadruplets who looked so much like their famous father. Alexander sat in his hotel suite, watching the media circus unfold on multiple screens. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since the story broke. The merger team was in panic mode. Their partners were getting nervous about the sudden family complications. "Sir," his assistant's voice came through the speaker. "The board is requesting an emergency meeting. They're concerned about stock stability." Alexander muted the call, his attention drawn to a text message that had just appeared on his personal phone. "The coffee shop on Chester Street. 30 minutes. Just you. Aria." His heart jumped. After yesterday's confrontation, all 4 kids had vanished, not responding to his attempts to reach them through Isabella. Now finally, a chance to talk. The coffee shop was small, tucked away from the main streets. Aria sat in a corner booth, a laptop open in front of her, her dark hair falling forward as she typed. She looked up as he approached, and that familiar ache hit him again. Those were his mother's eyes looking back at him. "You came alone," she said, closing her laptop. "Of course." He slid into the booth, noticing the 2 cups of coffee already on the table. "You knew my order." "Black coffee, no sugar. Mom used to complain about how boring your coffee taste was." A slight smile touched her lips. "I read every interview you've ever given. Did you know you mentioned coffee in 62% of them?" Alexander couldn't help but laugh. "You really are my daughter, always finding patterns." "That's why I asked you here," Aria said, her expression turning serious. I've been analyzing your company's latest project, the neural interface technology. There's a flaw in the base code. She opened her laptop again, turning it to face him. Alexander leaned forward, scanning the lines of code she highlighted. His eyes widened as he followed her logic. If this goes live with the next update, he began. Every device would be vulnerable, Aria finished. I found it last night. Couldn't sleep after. Everything. So I did what I always do when I'm stressed. I dug into code. Alexander stared at her in amazement. This would have cost the company billions. How did you even get access to this level of code? Mom didn't just teach us math, Aria said quietly. She taught us ethics too. When I found the backdoor in your system, I didn't exploit it. I'm showing you instead. Before Alexander could respond, the coffee shop door opened and James walked in. He hesitated when he saw them, but Aria waved him over. You showed him the code? James asked, sliding in next to his sister. You knew about this. Alexander looked between them. I found the vulnerability, James admitted. Aria figured out how to patch it. We've been keeping an eye on Sterling Tech for a while now. Alexander felt a surge of pride followed by humility. His children had been protecting his company without him even knowing they existed. The door chimed again. Michael entered, looking uncomfortable but determined. The stock's down 12% since the news broke, he said without preamble. But I have a plan to stabilize it. You're supposed to be in class, Aria said, but she was smiling. Some things are more important than perfect attendance. Michael pulled up a chair. The market's reacting to uncertainty. We need to control the narrative. Alexander watched in amazement as his children, 3 of them now, began discussing strategies to save his company's reputation and fix the code vulnerability. They worked together seamlessly, each bringing their own strengths to the table. His phone buzzed. Another board member demanding answers. But for the first time in his career, the business wasn't his first priority. Has anyone heard from Daniel? He asked during a pause in their discussion. The siblings exchanged looks. He's taking it hardest, James explained. He's been our protector since we were kids, always looking out for us for Mom. It's shaken his whole identity. He's at the youth center, Aria added softly. He goes there when he needs to think. Works with the kids there. Alexander nodded, understanding. Daniel, who'd grown up being the man of the family, suddenly had to deal with a father appearing out of nowhere. You know, Michael said, looking directly at Alexander for the first time, Mom never said anything bad about you. Even when we were angry about not having a dad, she just said you were someone who lost his way but had good in his heart. The words hit Alexander hard. After everything, Isabella had protected his image in their children's eyes. I did lose my way, he admitted. I forgot what really mattered. But I'd like to find it again, if you'll help me. Well, James said, gesturing at his laptop screen, you can start by looking at this code patch we designed. Because right now, your entire neural interface project is about as stable as our family dynamics. The unexpected joke broke the tension. Even Michael cracked a smile. Outside, reporters still waited with cameras ready. The board was still demanding answers. The merger was still in jeopardy. But in this small coffee shop, something more important was happening. A family was slowly, carefully beginning to build bridges. 2 weeks had passed since the world discovered Alexander Sterling's secret family. The media storm had settled into a quiet drizzle, but inside Sterling Tech's headquarters, a different kind of storm was brewing. James sat in what used to be a storage room, now converted into his temporary workspace. Scattered energy drink cans and takeout containers testified to the long hours he'd spent here. On his screens, lines of code scrolled endlessly, the foundation of Sterling Tech's next big project. You're doing it wrong, Alexander said from the doorway, a fun smile on his face. That's exactly what I used to tell my developers until I realized they were actually improving my original design. James didn't look up, his fingers flying over the keyboard. Your base code is good, but it's stuck in the past. The world's moved on from when you wrote this. Show me, Alexander said, pulling up a chair. For the next hour, father and son worked side by side, James explaining his innovations while Alexander shared stories about writing the original code in his garage 20 years ago. Neither mentioned how natural it felt, this sharing of knowledge across generations. Across the building, Michael sat in on his first board meeting. He'd insisted on attending, saying he needed to understand the business side of their legacy. Alexander watched with pride as his son asked pointed questions about market strategy and future investments. But there was something in Michael's eyes that worried him, a hardness that reminded Alexander too much of himself at that age. The way Michael dismissed concerns about smaller competitors, his focus solely on profit margins, it was like looking in a mirror of the past. In the research department, Aria had practically moved in. She'd taken one look at their development process and reorganized everything, creating a system so efficient that the head of R&D had offered her a job on the spot. She worked closely with the teams but kept to herself during breaks, reminding Alexander of Isabella's quiet determination. "She's been asking about the Chen bankruptcy," Isabella said during one of their now regular phone calls to discuss the children. "They all have. I think they're trying to understand who you are." Alexander rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of past decisions. "And what did you tell them?" "The truth. That power changes people, and that's what I was afraid of." Isabella paused. "Michael reminds me of you back then." "I know," Alexander admitted. "I see it too." The conversation stuck with him as he walked through the office later that day. He found Michael in the conference room, reviewing acquisition proposals. This small tech startup, Michael was saying to a group of executives, they won't sell. But if we squeeze their supply chain, block their partnerships. "No," Alexander said firmly from the doorway. Everyone turned to look at him. Michael stood up, challenge in his eyes. "It's just business. Isn't that what you always said? I've read about your tactics. This is no different." "It's exactly what I would have done at your age," Alexander agreed, walking into the room. "And I would have been wrong. Everyone out, please. I need to talk to my son." The executives filed out quickly, leaving father and son facing each other across the polished conference table. "You're going soft," Michael accused. "This company was built on being ruthless when necessary." "This company was built on innovation and vision," Alexander corrected. "The ruthlessness, that was my fear. Fear of losing control, of someone else getting ahead. It cost me my marriage, my chance to see you grow up, and the respect of people who trusted me." "But you won," Michael insisted. "You're one of the most powerful men in tech." "And I would trade half my empire to have been there for your first steps." Alexander's voice cracked slightly. "Power isn't just about winning, son. It's about what you do with it." The door opened and Daniel walked in, a surprise, since he'd kept his distance from Sterling Tech until now. "The youth center's computer lab crashed," he said without preamble. "They lost all their educational software. 20 kids can't complete their courses." Michael looked up from his acquisition papers. "What does that have to do with us?" "Everything," Alexander said, understanding dawning. He turned to Michael. "That startup you want to crush, what do they make?" Michael checked his notes. "Educational software for underprivileged." "Oh. Instead of destroying them, what if we help them expand? Partner with them, use our resources to get their software to more kids," Alexander suggested. "Like the kids at my youth center?" Daniel asked, a glimmer of interest in his eyes. For the first time, Alexander saw all his children's strengths aligning. James can help optimize their code. Aria can streamline their development process. Michael, you understand market expansion better than anyone. And Daniel, you know exactly what these kids need. A sterling legacy that builds things up instead of tearing them down, Daniel said slowly, nodding. Michael stared at his acquisition papers for a long moment. Finally, he looked up. "I'll need to completely revise these proposals." "I'll help," Daniel offered, surprising everyone. "I spend every day with the kids who need this. I know what works." Alexander watched his sons begin to work together, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. The sterling legacy was changing, evolving into something better than he could have built alone. His phone buzzed, a message from Aria. James found something in the old code. "You need to see this. Bring coffee with sugar this time." He smiled, typing back a quick reply. Outside his window, the city stretched out before him, full of possibilities. But the real treasure was right here in this building, his children, each carrying a piece of his drive, but tempering it with their mother's wisdom. The Sterling legacy would be different from now on. Better, stronger, more human. The warning signs were there, but Alexander had been too happy to notice them. Too caught up in the joy of finally having his family around him, watching his children thrive in the corporate world he built. It wasn't until the emergency board meeting that everything started to unravel. "Someone's been buying up our shares through shell companies," the CFO explained, his face grim on the video call. "They've accumulated nearly 20% of the company in the past month alone." Alexander felt his stomach drop. He knew these tactics. He'd invented many of them himself. Who? "That's the thing," James cut in from his workspace, surrounded by screens of data. "The paper trail is brilliant. Every time I trace it back, it leads to another dead end." Aria, who'd been quietly analyzing the patterns, looked up from her laptop. "The strategy, it's familiar. Almost like something I would do," Michael finished, walking into the room. But instead of looking concerned, he wore a slight smile that sent chills down Alexander's spine. The room fell silent as understanding dawned. Alexander stood slowly, facing his son. "Michael?" "I learned from the best," Michael said calmly. "Studied every takeover you ever executed. But I found ways to improve on your methods." "Those shell companies," James whispered, "they're yours." Michael nodded. "Along with another 15% of shares I've acquired through various other channels, combined with the 5% inheritance you promised each of us." He let the math sink in. "You're trying to take control of the company," Aria realized, her voice barely audible. "Not trying," Michael corrected. "By this time tomorrow, I'll have enough shares to force a vote of no confidence in the current leadership." He turned to Alexander. "You taught me that business is about seizing opportunities. That's exactly what I'm doing." Alexander felt like he'd been punched in the gut. His own words, his own tactics, turned against him by his own son. "This isn't just about business, Michael. This is family." "Family?" Michael's calm facade cracked slightly. "You weren't family for 18 years. You swept in here with your billions and your big ideas about legacy, but where were you when we actually needed a father?" The words hung in the air like physical things. James and Aria exchanged worried looks, while Alexander struggled to find his voice. "He's right." Daniel's voice came from the doorway, making everyone turn. He'd been so quiet lately, so busy with his youth center work, that his presence was a surprise. "You went there." "But Michael, this isn't the answer." Michael's eyes narrowed. "I'm doing what needs to be done. The company's too focused on feel-good projects now. The youth center initiatives, the educational software partnerships, they're dragging down our profits." "Those projects are helping real people," Daniel argued. "Kids like the ones I work with." "Kids don't pay the bills," Michael snapped. "This is business, not charity." Alexander watched the scene unfold, hearing echoes of his own past. How many times had he said similar things? How many lives had he affected with that same cold logic? "I need to show you something," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension. "All of you, right now." Without waiting for a response, he walked out of the office. After a moment's hesitation, his children followed. He led them to his private elevator, then up to the roof of the Sterling Tech building. The setting sun painted the city skyline in shades of gold and purple. Alexander pointed to a small building in the distance, barely visible among the skyscrapers. "That was our first office," he said softly. "Mr. Chen gave it to me when I was just starting out. Said he believed in my vision." He turned to face his children. "Michael, do you know where he is now?" Michael shifted uncomfortably. "He went bankrupt. It was just business." "He drives a taxi," Alexander interrupted. "I saw him last week, picking up passengers outside our building. The man who gave me my start spends his retirement driving people around the city I helped him build." The words seemed to hit Michael like physical blows. "But you always said tough decisions were necessary." "I was wrong," Alexander said simply. "And now I'm watching my son make the same mistakes, using the same excuses." Aria stepped forward, placing a hand on Michael's arm. "The code you used to hide your purchases, it was based on my security protocols, wasn't it?" Michael nodded slightly. "You're the best programmer I know." "I borrowed some of your work." "And the shell companies," James added, "they're registered through systems I helped develop." "We all contributed to this," Daniel said quietly. Every time we looked the other way when Michael started acting more aggressive in meetings, every time we dismissed it as him being ambitious. Alexander watched understanding dawn on Michael's face, the same understanding he'd come to years too late. Power isn't just about what you can take, he told his son. It's about what you can build, who you can help. I forgot that once, nearly lost everything that mattered. I have the votes, Michael said, but his voice had lost its certainty. By tomorrow. By tomorrow you could own the company, Alexander agreed. But you'd lose your family. Again, is that really what you want? The sun had almost set now, casting long shadows across the rooftop. In the growing darkness, Michael looked younger, more vulnerable. I just wanted to prove I could do it, he whispered. Prove I was worthy of the sterling name. You already have. Isabella's voice came from behind them. She stepped out of the elevator, notes from her evening class still in her hand. All of you have. Not by what you own, but by who you've become. Mom, Michael's voice cracked. How did you? Aria called me, Isabella said simply. Because that's what family does. We show up for each other, even when it's hard. Even when we're angry or hurt or scared. Alexander watched as something broke in Michael's expression. His son, the boy he'd missed growing up, the man he was still getting to know, seemed to crumple in on himself. I'll sell the shares back, Michael said quietly. All of them. I need help figuring out how to do it right this time. We'll help, James offered immediately. All of us. As his children huddled together, beginning to plan, Alexander caught Isabella's eye. She gave him a small nod, a gesture that spoke volumes. Their family had bent, but it hadn't broken. History had threatened to repeat itself, but this time, love had proven stronger than power. 6 months had passed since the night on the rooftop. The Sterling Tech building looked different now. Walls had been knocked down to create open spaces, and the once sterile corporate environment now hummed with collaborative energy. But the biggest changes weren't in the building itself. Alexander stood in the doorway of what used to be his private conference room, now converted into a shared family office. Each corner reflected its occupant's personality. James's workspace cluttered with programming books and empty coffee cups, Aria's area meticulously organized with complex diagrams on the walls, Daniel's section filled with youth center project plans, and Michael's desk. Michael's desk was empty. He's at the community center again, Aria said, noticing her father's gaze. Teaching business skills to high school students. Can you believe it? Alexander smiled, remembering how things had changed after that night. Michael had indeed sold back his shares, but more importantly, he'd found a new way to use his talents. The takeover attempt that could have torn them apart had instead brought them closer. Dad? James called from his corner. Remember that educational software company we partnered with? Their new platform just hit 1 million users. Kids in 30 countries are learning to code because of it. Before Alexander could respond, Daniel burst into the room, his face lit up with excitement. You need to come see this, he said, barely containing his enthusiasm. All of you. They followed him to the building's ground floor, where the once imposing lobby had been transformed into a community space. Through the glass walls, Alexander could see Mr. Chen, his old mentor whom he'd once betrayed, standing with Michael in front of a group of teenagers. The Sterling Chen Youth Technology Initiative, Daniel explained proudly. Michael's idea. We're combining Mr. Chen's teaching experience with our resources. Every kid gets a mentor, access to technology, and real business guidance. Alexander felt his throat tighten as he watched Michael, the son who'd nearly followed his path to ruthless success, patiently explaining business concepts to eager young faces. Mr. Chen caught his eye through the glass and gave a small nod. The gesture of forgiveness meant more than any business deal ever had. There's more, Aria added, pulling up a presentation on her tablet. Remember the Neural Interface Project? We've repurposed it. Instead of just another tech gadget, it's being developed to help children with learning disabilities. The first trials start next month. Speaking of next month, James interrupted, grinning. Mom's finally agreed to move her advanced mathematics program into the new education wing. No more cramped community college classroom. The mention of Isabella made Alexander's heart skip a beat. Their relationship had evolved too, not back to what it was, but into something different, something stronger. co-parents, friends, partners in this strange new family adventure. As if summoned by the thought, Isabella walked through the front doors, carrying a stack of textbooks. The security guard, who once would have stopped anyone without proper clearance, greeted her by name and offered to help with her load. "I thought I'd find you all here," she said, joining them. "Ready for our first official family dinner?" The weekly family dinners had been Aria's idea. A way to stay connected, to share their lives beyond business. Tonight would be the first one held at Alexander's penthouse, a space that had always felt too big, too empty until now. "Before we go," Michael said, emerging from the classroom, "there's something you should see, Dad." He handed Alexander a folder. The quarterly reports. Alexander opened it, expecting financial statements. Instead, he found letters, dozens of them. From kids in the technology program, from parents whose children were using their educational software, from community organizations they'd helped. "The real profits," Michael said softly, "not in dollars, but in lives changed." The elevator ride to the penthouse was crowded with all 6 of them, filled with overlapping conversations about projects and plans. Alexander stayed quiet, watching his family, the one he'd lost and found and almost lost again, interact with an ease that seemed impossible 6 months ago. His penthouse had changed too. Gone were the stark modern furnishings and empty walls. Now children's artwork from the youth center hung beside complex technical diagrams. A piano, insisted upon by Aria, sat in one corner, while family photos covered the surfaces. As they gathered around the dining table, Alexander looked at each face. James, already deep in discussion with Isabella about incorporating advanced mathematics into their coding programs. Aria, showing Daniel her latest designs for the neural interface's educational applications. Michael, more relaxed than he'd been in months, laughing at something Mr. Chen, now a regular guest at these gatherings, had said. "Quite a change from board meetings and hostile takeovers," Isabella commented quietly, taking the seat beside him. Alexander nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The empire he'd built seemed small compared to this noisy, complicated, wonderful family that had somehow found its way back together. "Mom, tell them about the new scholarship program," Aria called from across the table. "The one for single parents going back to school." As Isabella began explaining her latest project, funded by Sterling Tech but run entirely on her terms, Alexander realized something profound. His legacy wouldn't be measured in patents or profit margins. It would live on in James's dedication to using technology for good, in Aria's brilliant innovations to help others, in Daniel's commitment to giving back, and in Michael's journey from ruthless ambition to compassionate leadership. "I was wrong," he said suddenly, making everyone turn to look at him. "All those years ago, when I thought power meant controlling everything. Real power is in letting go, in trusting others, in building something together." Michael raised his glass. "To building something together." "To family," James added. "To second chances," Isabella said softly. As their glasses clinked together, Alexander looked around at his family, not perfect, still healing, but together. The sun was setting over the city skyline, painting the room in warm golden light, and for the first time in his life, Alexander Sterling felt truly, completely rich.